Hi, welcome to the bathtub. It's the old master bather and the old master bather's parakeet. Dodo the Wonder Parakeet. Clear mountain water, no pixels. You know this drill. We don't do anything. We do YouTubing the way your grandma used to do it, and and we haven't missed any. Nothing since your grandma's gotten any better. That's all I can tell you. We're going to do a very quick one. We're going to cover a lot of books really quickly. That's what we like to do here at the bathtub. We like to say literally nothing important about lots of interesting things. So we're going to talk about this. The premise of this show is one I sort of played around with last week, which is I'm going to give you the names of writers who I think are worth reading everything they wrote. So everything these writers wrote is worth reading, in my experience. And they're writers who I have read pretty closely. Most of our old favorites are going to show up. There's not too many surprises. But for example, there's lots of writers who I do really like, who we talk about here and now and then, or haven't or should talk about. I mean, for example, I'm a Nabokov fan. Nabokov, I like a lot of his books a lot, but I wouldn't put him on the list of every book is worth reading. I mean, if you really want to be the completist, like some of us, I've read a lot of his books. I think I've read every one of his novels, but there's a few of them I wouldn't recommend. It's probably me, but I don't get as much of a kick out of him. I love John Updike. I'm a big fan of his late work. I like his stuff from about the 80s, from the 80s on. Like, I hate the first two Rabbit books, Rabbit Run and Rabbit Redux, but I love the later ones. I love The Witches of Eastwick. About this period when his books start really taking off is in the 80s. I love his work from that point on. And I like a lot of his work, but I wouldn't recommend reading everything John Updike read, unless you're kind of, like some of us, just an annoying completist. But for someone who just wants to have a good time in the bathtub, I'm just going to give you names of some writers who I think are they're never uninteresting. And they're never unenjoyable. No, take that back. They're always enjoyable. It's just pure pleasure to read almost everything they wrote. We're going to start off William Trevor. We're reading all the novels of William Trevor backwards, if you recall. It's one of our many endless theme shows on this stupid program. And basically, any book you read by William Trevor is worth reading, and it's kind of is a pleasure. It's a pleasure, particularly his short stories. So any of it, this is beyond the pale. Any collection of his stories. This one comes out in 1981, but his book Last Stories we've talked about on the show, which he wrote, near the end of his life, and his very first book collection of stories, The Day We Got Drunk on Cake. Every one of his collections, every story is a great bathtub. Okay, you're going to have a good time and have a nice time in the bathtub. Of his novels, they're a little weaker, but I still enjoy them. And I haven't read all the novels of William Trevor. We're still doing those on our little show we're doing. But if I was going to pick one, you can pick any collection of stories. You won't go wrong. Okay, any collection of stories by Trevor. If I was going to suggest a novel, and I'm going to suggest one book by each of these authors you should try, I would probably suggest the story of Lucy Galt. If you haven't read Trevor and you want to get a taste of what he does, it's very episodic. It's like many of his novels. It doesn't really have a really strong narrative drive, but it's kind of a beautiful book about loss. That's basically, his stories are almost always about loss, and it's about a girl who gets lost, who's sort of accidentally abandoned by her parents, and what her life is like. It's a very lovely, haunting book, and I think it's a good way to introduce yourself to the great William Trevor. Every Dickens book is worth reading. I've read every single Dickens book, usually twice or three times in my life, and I've enjoyed them all. I read most of them when I was a kid. Yeah, we've talked about it a million times, but every single novel. So the first half of his work, up till about David Copperfield, his books are a lot more episodic and a little less structured. They're like the Pickwick Papers, lots of different stories going in different directions. But if I was to pick one book for you to read, Charles Dickens's, and you haven't read him, read David Copperfield. It's one of the great, great, great pleasurable novels, great bathtub read. And then the book, which probably his best put together book, and the one that I love the most, is The Bleak House. I guess Bleak House, it's a tougher book. It's a lot more complicated book, but both of them are wonderful reads, so you could try them. We're Simenon fans here. I've never read a Simenon book I didn't have a good time with. sometimes at least 2 times, sometimes 3 times. I forget them when I literally forget the Simenon novels I read, and I read them again. I enjoy them all over again. At the moment I'm reading Maigret Hesitates. We're going to talk about some more Simenon soon. But if I was to recommend one book by Simenon, every book of his is worth reading. So any one of his books you get, you'll be doing okay. I would probably recommend this first omnibus from Penguin because it has 2 of my favorite of his thrillers, The Neighbors and Measurement Vanishes, and then Maigret in the Nahur Case. That's a good Maigret. So that's a good volume, but anything you read, but every single novel he ever wrote, I've ever read, is always good. Thriller writers, we've talked about the late, greatest thriller writer of all time, the wonderful Ross Thomas. I've never read a Ross Thomas novel. His books go all over the place. Some are a little better than others. Most of the time they're fun. They're great joy. Lovely literary intelligence. Writes beautiful sentences, beautiful paragraphs, beautiful scenes, and everything he does is really well done. If I was to pick one, Chinaman's Chance is really possibly the very best of them as far as just your first read. That was my first read. But I'd also recommend The Fools in Town Are on Our Side. We've talked about that. One of the greatest titles in the history of literary thrillers. And anything he writes is worth reading. But either one of those would get you started on him, and you can read everything he wrote. Now, he actually wrote some books under a pseudonym, Oliver Bleak. I have enjoyed these. They're not as good. So I've sort of broken the rule a little bit. All the Ross Thomas books are worth reading. He never wrote a bad book that I can think of. Unlike a lot of writers who've written books that just aren't, sometimes they're not as good. Evelyn Waugh, one of my favorite British writers, his first 6 novels, just brilliant. And his later novels, they're all over. So I couldn't put him on this list, as much as I love his work. Oliver Bleak, not as good. You don't need to read those as much. F. Scott Fitzgerald. I've come to the conclusion late in life that everything he wrote is worth reading, is a pleasure to read. My favorite and the place to start is not Great Gatsby, because they made you do that already in high school, right? Tender as the Night. Tender as the Night, one of the great, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful books. Some mystery stories. Some of us like mysteries. Stupid, pointless mysteries in which we try to find who the killer is. Rex Stout. Nero Wolfe. You can read I've got the whole pile up there. You can read the whole series. There's not a bad book in there. Not a bad one, really. There's one, the Golden Mountain, where they kind of wander around Yugoslavia, I found a little boring. But most of this stuff is great. I would recommend Black Orchids as a starting point for Rex Stout, simply because it's a couple of novellas. My favorite Nero Wolfes are always the novellas. They're about 60 to 100 pages long, and you can read them pretty much in one bathtub or a bathtub and a half. And the whole stories are always lovely, lovely little narratives. Always fall together great. We're big fans of Flaubert, as he's properly pronounced. In the French Republic, Gustave Flaubert. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Gustave Flaubert. I've never read a bad book of his. Some of his books are pretty weird. The Last Temptation, we talked about The Last Temptation of St. Anthony. It's a weird book, but it's worth reading. I've never read a page of Flaubert that wasn't just beautifully written, and but the best place to start. Even his letters. Most of these people actually wrote even good letters. You can read a book of, even Fitzgerald's letters are fun to read. And that would be Madame Bovary. I think that's the best place to start. Your first shot of him would be Madame Bovary. Tom Dish, old friend. I think I've read everything Tom ever wrote. His poetry, his essays, his book reviews, his novels, his short stories, everything he did. He wrote even good movies, a couple good TV scripts and so forth. Children's books. Everything he wrote is worth reading and is fun to read. Where to start? My favorite is still The Priest, because it brings together 2 things that Tom did well. Great kind of narrative, just energy. 2, his hatred of the Catholic Church. It just drips with hatred for the Catholic Church, and it's funny, and it's wicked, and it's just and it actually most of his novels sometimes fall apart at the end. He has a really nice ending on this book. One of our favorites we talk about all the time here, Richard Yates. I have read every short story, every novel by Richard Yates. Everything he wrote is worth reading. They published his collected stories many years after his death, which included several uncollected stories, which perhaps he was slightly embarrassed by. Everything in the book was great. Every short story I've ever read by Richard Yates was wonderful, and all his novels. And he was often, sadly, misrepresented as a one-hit wonder with Revolutionary Road. Every one of his novels is wonderful. Even his last one, Cold Spring Harbor. The best place to start with Revolutionary Road or a book of short stories by Richard Yates. Everything he wrote was worth reading. We're reading through Cormac McCarthy, so it's no surprise. Yeah, I think you can pretty much. I think everything he wrote is worth reading. Even some of the kind of questionable, mixed up a bit books, such as The Play we talked about, The Stonemason, or Sunset Limited. I think it was another kind of weird play. Everything he wrote is good. Up and wherever there's maybe occasional, they're not perfect. No one's perfect, but they're all worth reading. And The Road's a good place to start. It was very difficult finding one because his books are very different from one another in some ways. I'm not talking as far as best book, but The Road is awfully good, as I recall, from my one time reading it. And it's a good place to start if you've never read Cormac McCarthy. We talked about Brian Moore, my old buddy, one of my all-time favorite writers, the writer I probably read the most often of all these writers. I've read all of Brian's books many, many times, and picking one is tricky. The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn is his most famous. I really have a soft spot for The Lonely Passion, the Temptation of Eileen Hughes. These are his more realistic novels, but he also did some great magic realism novels like Cold Heaven and so forth. But I would say if it's not Judith Hearn, this was one people don't know about as much. The Temptation of Eileen Hughes. That's a terrific Brian Moore novel. And again, every novel he wrote is worth reading. Even the couple that don't quite work for me, I still reread occasionally because they're just so well done. I've never read a Chekhov story that wasn't good. I mentioned this before as a good place. This is Lady with Lapdog and other stories. We did a long talk about Chekhov recently. I've read dozens and dozens and dozens of his stories many times over. His letters are fun to read as well. I think there's stuff of his I haven't read, but I've never read anything of his that wasn't worth reading, wasn't enjoyable. Continuously high marks, always, never kind of these dips and weaknesses in his career. It's always good. And I also mentioned that there's I forget what I mentioned in a previous talk. There's an online edition of his complete stories. The Delphi edition? I forget now. It's only like $2. And it includes a lot of early stories by Chekhov that are not easy to find. Lots of his early short stories. And it's a terrific read. I think I read through that whole collection by now. Graham Greene. He wrote a lot of different books, comedies, entertainment, spy thrillers, serious novels. Essays. His essays are all wonderful. His criticism is always good. His movie reviews are always fun. I've never read anything bad by Graham Greene. Every sentence and every paragraph is this intelligence just popping all through it. Which book I would recommend? Probably I often used the Our Man in Havana in classes because it's just such a crowd pleaser. But my favorite of his novels is The Human Factor. It's a really lovely novel. And I think this is a good place to start if you haven't read much Graham Greene. It kind of introduces you to a lot of his work. Getting near the end of our bottom of our pile here. Again, there's other writers. I can't think of too many writers who I would recommend to read everything of theirs. Like I'm looking at James M. Cain over here. James M. Cain wrote a lot of really good thrillers, but he wrote a few that were a little boring, I thought. I never quite got through them. I've never read a bad story by Maupassant. I haven't read a couple of his novels. I've read many different editions of his short stories. Never read a bad story. My favorite of his novels is Bel Ami. Really, really, really terrific, cynical, comic novel about this horrible kid in Paris wanting to be successful. And then all of his short stories are great. I tend to prefer the older translations. I don't know why, but some of these old Penguin translations. And here's one I really remember reading, enjoying. It's Roger Collette's Selected Short Stories of Maupassant, and it's one of many different editions of his stories I've enjoyed. And I've never read a bad collection of stories by him. Finally, one of the only writers who I've probably read everything he wrote, and that is George Orwell. We've talked about Orwell. I've actually got the complete Orwell set because I did a piece on it 25 years ago when it came out in London. And he's a, like all these, like many writers, he's mainly a great essayist. He's best known to most of you as for 1984 and for Animal Farm. Not necessarily the high points of his career, in my opinion. I love his essays, and yet I have read almost this entire. All his novels are in this series. I read all of his novels, most of them twice. I was trying to think of which one I would recommend. Probably his earliest book, Down and Out in Paris and London, simply because it has all the hallmarks of him, which is the recognition of the daily trivial, horrible details of life, and getting your cigarettes and paying for your bills and trying to get food and trying to do work and doing horrible jobs for money. Keep the Aspidistra Flying has some great stuff in it too. But for a novel, I'd probably recommend this or Keep the Aspidistra Flying. But I would really recommend a collection of just his best essays. Penguin has a couple of different editions of his essays, and you continually learn what's always been happening in our world. Orwell was right about what's going on today 80 years ago. So he's worth keeping up with. There you go. As fast as I could, all these writers, as far as I'm concerned, you can read everything they wrote, which I don't think we can say that about too many writers. There's lots of good writers out there, but every single one of their books is pretty much a joy. Okay? All right. That's it. Stay safe.